Welcome to this study event on Owen Wingrave. My name is Lucy Walker, and I'm the Director of Learning up at the Red House, the Britten-Pears Foundation, just up the road in Aldeburgh. So to start with, we're going to hear a lot about the opera in some detail and from all different angles. But I'm going to start with a little context, or a number of contexts. This is a PowerPoint presentation, but don't worry, it's not going to be a sort of slow death by slide presentation. I'm hoping it will be interesting, and I've animated them to keep people's attention going, so hopefully it'll keep your interest. Yes, we'll hopefully keep awake. I'm just going to provide some contextual information where it comes in Britain's repertoire and a number of other angles relating to Owen Wingrave as we go through, before we introduce our first speaker. This is Paramore in one of David Maesco-Jones's designs, and this is among, I think, one of the designs that we have on display up at the Red House. And David Maesco-Jones designed the sets, and we have a number of these beautiful pictures available up at the Red House in our collection. So that's just to give you just an introduction to Owen Wingrave through the very house in which it's set. And there is Benjamin Luxon as Owen Wingrave in the original production. And these are the context briefly. It looks an intimidating amount, but I promise you I will canter through these. This is just to show you how it sits in Britain's repertoire. So Britain's vocal dramas, I've called them, rather than operas, because not all of these could technically be described as operas. And there's a lot of them. And these are the dates beside them. I've put 71 next to Owen Wingrave, which was the date that it was first broadcast, rather than when it was written. It was written in the 2 preceding years. But as we can see, a great many operas before then. Between Midsummer Night's Dream and Owen Wingrave, 3 church parables. Britten left conventional opera and wrote these 3 church parables, which were performed in, as it might sound, in churches during the Aldeburgh festivals in those 3 years. And then came back to opera for his first and only opera written especially for television in 1971. It was his penultimate opera. It was transferred to Covent Garden stage in 1973, by which time he was well into Death in Venice by then. It's one of Britain's many operas that features male protagonists, and this perhaps stands him out from what you might think of as conventional opera composers, who often feature female protagonists, have strong female roles. There are lots of female roles in Britain's operas, but as you can see, a great many of them have a male name as their title, and also feature largely and predominantly male casts. So Owen Wingrave is certainly among one of those. And that picture there is Theodore Upman as Billy Budd in the 1951 production. In the short film that preceded the screening of Owen Wingrave last night at the cinema, which was a documentary made at the time, Britten himself mentioned that he quite often looks at the effect of the innocent and the treatment of innocent or innocence betrayed in his operas, and this is certainly true of a number of them here. Again, Owen Wingrave is one of those. This is a picture from Rape of Lucretia. So it's a theme that he returned to and returned to again throughout his career. Henry James and A Spooky Staircase. This is quite an important one. It's the second time he turned to Henry James for inspiration. First was in Turn of the Screw, which was his 1954 opera, and was also a collaboration with Mifanwy Piper, the same librettist for both, as we'll come to shortly. And he, I think, read the story of Owen Wingrave sometime earlier and then reacquainted himself with it. Both of them are shortish stories. Owen Wingrave in particular is only 30 or so pages in the published edition. And both do feature a supernatural element. It's very, very strong in Turn of the Screw. It's what the opera is about, really. In Owen Wingrave, it's less dominant, but it does increasingly become important in the second act, and then certainly becomes part of the ambiguity and mysterious nature of the opera's ending. So this is something that Britain had been in this territory before and returned to. Henry James is always ambiguous, or in these 2 stories particularly very ambiguous, and lends this uncertainty, and you're not quite sure why or what has happened at the end of his tales. And I mentioned Mifanwy Piper, and she was Britain's collaborator on 3 of his operas. The Turn of the Screw, as I just mentioned, Owen Wingrave, and his last opera, death in Venice. She was married to the designer John Piper, and the artist John Piper, who was also a close collaborator of Britten. So both of them were extremely important to Britten's stage works throughout his career. This is just an example here. This is part of the shooting script, and this is one of the things that is on show at the Red House. And this was something that Myfanwy Piper had to get to grips with, was how to write a script, and Britten also, how to actually write an opera for television. And this is something that Frances is going to talk about in her paper. But this wasn't something either of them knew awfully much about. Britten didn't even own a television set. I don't think ever owned a television set, although I think he'd been presented with one. I don't think he ever watched it. So it wasn't something he was familiar with, and there are obviously big differences between writing an opera for the television screen and writing opera for the stage, and Britten was largely familiar with the stage. So that took a certain amount of getting to grips with. Now, pacifism, we see a whole different context here. This is something that is the particular subject of the exhibition at the Red House, which is called Conscientious Objections. And this explores Britten's own personal relationship to his own pacifism and the expressions of it. He didn't go in particularly, he occasionally did, but generally didn't go in for making public statements in words or in journalism or in writing about his pacifist views, but it did come out in his music and in a number of his works. But you can see the date spread here. There's quite a lot that could be said to have a pacifist theme or be metaphorically related to pacifism, or directly, such as Pacifist March, which was written when he had joined the Peace Pledge Union in the late 1930s. And in that period, leading up to his departure to America, he was very heavily involved in the pacifist cause. It was extremely important to him. He didn't make so much of a public statement over the sort of 40s and 50s, and then did return to it in the 1960s, a very public statement of which, or discussion of which, is the War Requiem, which presents the mass against a background of Wilfred Owen's poetry in a challenging and extraordinary way. And there are a number of other works that, while perhaps not directly pacifist as such, address the effects of war on the innocent, and particularly the innocence of children in the Children's Crusade, and they very much depict suffering as a result of conflict. So this was something that was becoming increasingly important to him throughout the 1960s. And Owen Wingrave is certainly about pacifism and addresses the issue of violence and pacifism directly, and taking a stand against the need to be a soldier, the need to participate in conflict. So that was something strongly important to Britten. At the top there we have his card, his registration as a conscientious objector. When he returned from the States in 1942, where he'd been living for the last 3 years, he registered as a conscientious objector, as did Peter Pears. He had to go through a number of tribunals in order to achieve that status, and then was registered as a CO for the duration of the war. He and Peter Pears participated in recitals up and down the country as their contribution, and they performed in numerous recital venues all over the country, but up until 1945.
In 1965, I was...
That needs a little introduction. We're wondering why suddenly we're seeing David Attenborough. David Attenborough, this is just quite a nice clip. He was the controller of BBC Two at the time that Owen Wingrave was commissioned. And so I just wanted to include this clip, which we have on one of our websites, the Britain 100 website, but he does relate the story of the circumstances of the commission, and I thought it was rather nice just to play that.
In 1965, I was appointed controller of BBC Two, which was the BBC's second television network and the third television network in the country. The BBC, of course, had always had a very important commitment to contemporary music in radio. And the question is, what could television do about it? And BBC Two took on that problem, and it mounted 2 really remarkable productions of Britten operas, Billy Budd and Peter Grimes, but also the chamber operas, Burning Fiery Furnace. So Britten was aware of the problems and the opportunities, and he had agreed to do write a special opera for television which would exploit television in all kinds of ways, which he thought about deeply. And the subject was Owen Wingrave, with supernatural overtones, in which he hoped we might be able to use television to produce supernatural effects, as it were. That was already in hand when I was appointed to BBC Two, but it fell to me to do the official thing and invite the composer and have a lunch and talk about the whole thing, which we duly did. I was much in awe, of course, so treading very delicately, since I'm not a musician. And in the course of the lunch, Britten said to me, how many French horns can I have? And of course, I had no idea at all. So I said, any number you like, Mr. Britten. And he said, that is not the answer I require. And I felt frightfully put down, but he's quite right. I mean, you know, he wanted to know the financial scale, the costs and so on.
It's wonderful. And just while we're on the subject of television operas, this was the first television opera that Britten was involved in that he composed directly for television, but a number of his operas had been on television. There was an associated rediffusion production of Turn of the Screw in 1959 that was broadcast, and also Billy Budd, as Sir David Attenborough mentioned, Billy Budd and Peter Grimes were broadcast by the BBC. And Peter Grimes was filmed at the Maltings, as Owen Wingrave was as well. And instead of using a London studio, and when you see the original production of Owen Wingrave, you wonder how on earth this was achieved to fit this huge set and the orchestra and the singers and everybody singing live and recording live onto the camera. You do wonder how that was made possible, but it was made possible in 1971 for the recording of Owen Wingrave. But there had been a number of other television operas, and this is only a few. There are actually a lot, and there's also, obviously, Britten's operas there, far more than I would have thought. Writer Jennifer Barnes has written a book called, I think it's The Rise and Fall of Television Opera, and she lists as her appendix the list of American and UK commissioned operas, and it's sort of 40 or so in each country, so it's a lot over the years, though not nearly so many recently. So one of the most famous, and is performed quite frequently in stage performances, is Menotti's Amal and the Night Visitors. It was 1951, which I gather was broadcast live. Owen Wingrave wasn't broadcast live, which would have been extremely complicated, but that was. And there's a number of other famous composers that you'll recognise the names of: Martineau, Arthur Benjamin, Malcolm Arnold, a number of these in the UK, Arthur Bliss, Stravinsky, Carl Davis, back in 1965, and then a number since Owen Wingrave as well. One that Jennifer Barnes doesn't mention because it came out since the publication of her book was Judith Weir's Armida, which was broadcast on Channel 4 in 2005. I don't think it's been repeated since. It's about 50 minutes long. And it's worth mentioning because it's, like Owen Wingrave, set in the context of conflict, actually directly in conflict. It's set in an unnamed Middle Eastern conflict, and about a journalist who is reporting on this and is encouraging the soldiers not to participate in the war. So it has a similar relationship to conflict and taking a stand against conflict. It's an extremely strong piece. So within that context, Owen Wingrave was actually one of many, so it seems rather unusual now, but there was a history of it. And I know Francis is going to tell us a little bit about the scope of the ambition for the numbers of people to see these performances, that they weren't just put on once and only seen by a handful of people. The audience figures were potentially quite huge for these performances. And as if by magic, that leads us into my introduction to Francis's talk, which we're going to come soon. This is a still from Owen Wingrave itself. Oh, sorry, I was wondered if that was part of my doom-laden introduction or presentation or something, but it's a... Yes, and Francis is going to talk specifically about Britten's collaboration with Myfanwy Piper on this production and on the television production. He's going to show some clips from that BBC show. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Frances Spalding. She's a professor in art history at Newcastle University and is the author of numerous books, including Lives of Roger Fry and Vanessa Bell, and a recent and extremely well-received joint biography of John and My Family Piper, which came out in 2009. Coming up in July is Frances' richly illustrated biography of Virginia Woolf, which accompanies a major exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery starting this summer. And she has written specifically on Owen Wingrave for a recent collection of Britten essays. And as I said, today we'll be talking about the collaboration with My Family Piper and the original television production of Owen Wingrave. So a warm welcome for Frances Spalding. Thank you very much.